Okay, thank you so much for being here this afternoon with us. We are starting this second panel on balancing threat and opportunities. Of course, we had the global pandemic and the COVID-19 that had China at the center of this disruption of the globalization process. And we had the southern region of NATO continues to have its stability jeopardized by a combination of encroaching powers. We are starting talking about Ukraine, but Ukraine changed something also in two regions that we want to talk about in the second panel. There are the Indo-Pacific region and the North African and Deep Maghreb. So I would like to introduce our distinguished guest, Richard Hooker, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council in DC, and Rajendra Abhyankar, the Ambassador, former Secretary of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, and former Ambassador of India to the European Union, and Christian Koch, Director of the Gulf Research Center in Jeddah. We start with a brief speech, and then we will have some question-answer session. Please, Hooker, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here today. So I'd like to sort of very briefly try to set in context China in a broader NATO agenda right now, and I think I'll begin by observing that how to deal with an ascendant China is a major issue that complicates transatlantic relations today. Perhaps not the number one priority, but certainly right at the top of the NATO agenda. So first, a U.S. perspective. As a historic Asia-Pacific power with key interests in that region for well over a century, the U.S. tends to view China's preponderant economic strength, its trade practices, its growing presence in international organizations, and its assertive military activity in the East and South China Seas as really dangerous developments. And many China firsters in the current administration also urge that NATO become more directly involved. So they would like to see NATO more engaged in the Pacific and more explicitly committed to providing forces in the event of a conflict or a confrontation there. Now, this view, I think, stands in contrast to that of many, probably most European leaders. And so while sensible to the threat of a rising and authoritarian China, the EU, for example, is China's largest trading partner and doesn't share the same security interest in the Asia-Pacific region as the United States does. In Europe, China is not seen to present the same kind of security threats and challenges. And so an important factor that we should bear in mind also is that the Washington Treaty does, in fact, have a specific geographic focus. And most European publics, in my opinion, are not likely to support committing large military forces in a conflict in Asia with China. And so these different perspectives combine to introduce some tension, I would say, in transatlantic relations. And this has been seen, for example, in the recent spat over the introduction of Chinese 5G technology in Europe, but also in other events such as China's commercial acquisition of the ports of Piraeus, Genoa, Hamburg, Bilbao, and Trieste. And so, accordingly, pressing NATO allies to commit to military action far from the North Atlantic area really may well introduce more dissension to a set of relationships that, as we all are aware, are already stressed by many other factors. And what are these? Well, they include a very dangerous and high-intensity war on NATO's borders in Ukraine, but also immigration from the Middle East and Africa, continuing threat of terrorism, difficult allies like Orban in Hungary and Erdogan in Turkey, defense spending and readiness conversations, and others as well. And so we can observe that there's also an ideological component to this issue. Perhaps not as explicitly as during the Cold War, but I think real nonetheless. China is an authoritarian state. and it wishes to legitimize its system of government, and other authoritarian leaders around the world are seeking to bandwagon with China to cement their own rule. And in this sense, China does represent a direct and even a serious challenge to Western democratic values and democracies. And so in my opinion, a business as usual approach is probably ill-advised. An example of this in recent years has been an apparent tendency to temper criticism of China in European political discourse for fear of a strong Chinese reaction. And Chinese officials are quick to attack any such criticism, however justified it may be. But now in recent years, NATO has taken note of these tensions and has become more pointed in addressing China. In the 2021 NATO summit was particularly noteworthy in describing China as a destabilizing force and a systemic challenge whose actions threaten the rules-based international order. So with all of this in mind, what should NATO's posture be with respect to China? I think a good starting place is at home in Europe, where Chinese commercial and intelligence activities provide opportunities for China to penetrate European politics, to create dependencies and liabilities that can be used to further Chinese interests and priorities all over the world. And here, for example, limits on European and Chinese dual-use technologies and commercial activities are well within NATO's remit and should be pursued in concert with the European Union. I'd kind of wrap up by observing that for a number of important reasons, I expect European leaders to resist calls for explicit military commitments in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region for a number of reasons. First, European force projection capabilities are just limited. Second, Russian aggression in the European security space is a far more direct and immediate threat. Third, European military force structure and resources, frankly, are limited. They're not global in scale or scope. Fourth, European publics are unlikely to support large-scale military ventures in Asia. And then fifth, U.S. allies and partners in the region, such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia, and others, they really provide significant militaries that, together with U.S. assistance, can contain or defeat Chinese aggression. So I'll close by observing that long ago in the famous Harmel report, NATO observed that it stood the test of time because it's historically important and it's currently relevant. The paradigm of both deterrence based on strong defense, but also continuous dialogue, this dual-track approach, has really stood the test of time. And I think it's a good guidepost or signpost for NATO going ahead into the future as well as looking back into the past. It's got a proven and successful track record. And I recommend that we continue on this course, but do so in a sort of a realistic way. I'd end my remarks by saying that it's important for NATO to have a global outlook, very important to have a global outlook, but also to take account of its limitations, its regional focus, and other pressing problems that are closer to home before being drawn into this ongoing conversation and, frankly, responding to this strong pressure to become more and more directly involved on the ground far from home. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Every time we think about the threat of the China, of the Republic into the Indo-Pacific region, we talk also about India. And we are engaging very good talks with India about how to contain this kind of threat by China. So, Ambassador Abhyankar, can you explain us how much the threat and opportunities are for NATO and the Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by recalling what the commander of the NATO Defense College said that earlier when we started, that with the rise of China, the US will inexorably have to turn to the Indo-Pacific. Now, as it happens, the Indo-Pacific is therefore an increasingly and becoming the center of world's gravity. It has half the world's population, 2/3 of the world's economy, 7 of the world's largest militaries. It has the maximum number of US troops based anywhere in any other region. It supports 3 million US jobs. It is a source of 900 billion foreign direct investments into the US. It drives 2/3 of the global economy. The US-Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific trade was $1.75 trillion in 2020. The US, of course, is the longest and the largest investor in this region. And finally, 68% of international students who go to the United States are from the Asia Pacific. So clearly, this is a region which needs considerable importance. So therefore, what should the US interest be? The US interest can be secured or advanced only if it firmly anchors itself in this region and strengthens it with its closest allies and partners. I'm repeating closest allies and partners for the simple reason that with the engagement of NATO in the Russia-Ukraine war, I have read just as early as yesterday that it is not certain by when the NATO will be able to extricate itself from this commitment in order to move or provide any kind of support to the Asia Pacific. But when it does, it will be a force multiplier. The question is, when will it do that? But that having been said, the region has mounting challenges. The first is, of course, as you mentioned, sir, that China has been using its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological prowess in order to carve out a sphere of influence for itself in the South China Sea, Taiwan, because of its strategic value, and its strategic assets, mainly its military equipment and its semiconductor industry. It has also used its BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, for political bullying and economic aggression. And we see that happening in Europe. So it's not as if, although China is far away, but it has been targeting European countries in this matter. It has tried coercion with Australia. It has an ongoing conflict with India on our borders. Then, of course, there's climate change, which continues to be a... Then there is the continuously mutating coronavirus pandemic, which doesn't seem to end. There's North Korea's pursuit of nuclear supremacy. So what is the goal? The goal has to be to make the Indo-Pacific free, open, secure, and resilient. The US must therefore strengthen its role while reinforcing the region to ensure that international rules apply in this region, which China is trying to subvert, particularly the law of the sea. There is, of course, the Quad, which includes the United States and which has a certain agenda about from increasing the number of vaccines available to encouraging vertical and emerging technologies, supply chain cooperation, joint technological development. I'm sorry, I'm running out of time, so let me just say that when NATO enters, it will be most welcomed as a force multiplier. But the question is that NATO has to be aware that it will not enter with absolutely positive sentiments. First is, of course, that the memory of Seattle which lasted from 55 to 77, are not very pleasant. It involved the US invasions, US actions in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Neither are the US interventions in Lebanon, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq seen very sympathetically in the Indo-Pacific region. So, and lastly, China is waiting to see how the NATO proceeds, or US proceeds on NATO, because it is their conviction that by creating smaller groups, what is sought to be done is to create an Asian NATO. An Asia-Pacific NATO. Whether that will happen or not, but there are any number of statements by the Chinese foreign minister to say that they are setting up, that the choice is between setting up these closed groups or keeping Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific available. The question really remains, and I end with that China can say what it likes, but it's doing what it wants. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Abhyankar. And talking about threats and opportunities, of course, we must watch also a very important region, that is the North Africa and deep Maghreb. So I'd like to ask to Mr. Koch, how much the influence of China and the parallel influence of NATO can be effective in the Maghreb area.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first of all say what a privilege it is to be here, and thank you very much to the ambassador, of course, and the NATO Defense College Foundation for the opportunity. I think I also want to start with a comment from Commandant Rittiman this morning, but it's more related to the fact that he talked about this danger of preoccupation with just the eastern flank, and that you begin to ignore other areas. And of course, I think here the Middle East continues to be in a very fragile state, very volatile, multi-dimensional threat environment that at any time can erupt again into another crisis. So that's an important factor of why whatever happens in the region will have an impact also on the Middle East, on the wider areas around the Middle East. I think it's also important to understand the changed circumstances in the region. When NATO first sort of designed some of its outreach to the Middle East in terms of the Mediterranean dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, there was this sort of little bit of a division between the Levant, the Maghreb, and the Gulf region. I think what we've seen now in the past sort of 2 decades, and specifically since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, is much more of a shift towards the Gulf. I think the Gulf has become sort of the strategic center for much of the Middle East, and you need to be able to adjust to those circumstances. What's also come along with this is a big transition in the region towards regional actors. I think what we see today is that Gulf states play a much more important and distinct role in regional affairs than maybe they have ever played before. They no longer can just be considered the oil producers or sort of the world's gas station. I think that has changed completely. The Gulf states have a lot of agency, and I think what they have shown specifically over the last 5 to 10 years is an increased readiness also to enter into the strategic environment in the overall region. And it's no longer just the issues very close to home. I think at the moment the problem still is that a lot of this is guided by uncertainty, and uncertainty comes, again, on multiple levels in the region. It's uncertainty at the domestic level when we talk about stability in the region, and we look at countries like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon. Where is the stability? Where is that going to evolve? Here, the Gulf has, especially the Arab Gulf states, have a particular issue with Iran. Iran as a sponsor of proxy forces to the region that undermines the stability of those states. And though so far there has not really been an effective answer against this kind of challenge. You know, this disruptive that takes states down, that we don't have an organizing principle as such. How do you deal with violent non-state actors? It's a big issue. Of course, you have the domestic challenges of governance, of leadership, overall of the energy transition. I think there's the Ukraine war has now once again brought energy security to the forefront and has highlighted the importance of the oil-producing states. But at the same time, they themselves know that, due to climate change, they have to make the transition from hydrocarbons. And there's been a lot of emphasis on this, but still, it's a challenge. We have the challenge then at the region, as I said, about Iran specifically on a multi-level of the fronts. And that's something where you need also international support. But here comes the international challenge. And that is concern about what is going to be the future role of the US in the region. The US has been the main security provider for the Gulf, for the Arab Gulf states in the past. But we've seen also a number of disappointments in recent times. We've seen the announced pivot to Asia. Where does that leave the region? While the region still has the problem with Iran. We see the announcements about the withdrawal, or the very abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan, which hasn't inspired confidence or we've seen developments like the attacks on the Saudi oil installations in September 2019, where there basically was no response. It's a clear violation of international law, and the region has felt exposed. So as a result here, we've seen the Gulf states also looking for alternatives, looking for other. Can they keep on relying on the American security umbrella? What's the alternative to that? Economically, the region has already shifted to Asia. Majority of oil exports are going there. So there is also this development of a strategic relationship with Asia. You maintain cooperation with Russia in the OPEC Plus framework because you need to know about security of supply also and bring some stability to the market. So on all that front, there's a big question mark now in the region about how does one position oneself. And I think here NATO can come in and can play an important role. But I think NATO, again, needs to adjust itself to a little bit of the circumstances in the region. And it is, on the one hand, acknowledge the agency also of the Gulf states, intensify your political dialogue, but begin to listen to their point of view. Ultimately, if we want to come up with a solution for the region, it has to come from the region. It cannot just be imposed from outside. But the region has ideas. But you need to invest also in listening to the region. This hasn't happened before. There's not been much listening to the region. And I think here NATO has a chance to, for example, through the regional center you have in Kuwait, this could be one platform where you can have these exchanges on a very regular basis. So also think about the medium to long-term implications of a changing transition, changing world order. How does the Gulf see itself? How does the Middle East see itself? I think there needs to be more investment in the bilateral, multilateral level. I think it needs to be, maybe we need to review the institutions of the Mediterranean dialogue and the ICI and maybe bring them more together under one umbrella. Because already, as I said, the Gulf states are active in Egypt, in Libya, in the Mediterranean. It's hard to just divide the two lines. And then if I have two other concrete proposals where I think effective cooperation can be pursued, one is on maritime security. Again, the strategic region itself, Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, majority of the traffic going through there. This is one area where needs to be more emphasis, and I think NATO can certainly play a role. And the second, and again I'll pick up on the commandant from this morning about stabilization strategies for the region itself. Iraq could be in a very interesting case. Iraq sits at the heart of the Middle East. Whatever happens in Iraq has implications for the whole region as a whole. So if we don't find a mechanism how to maintain the stability in Iraq, and again, Iraq is very fragile at the moment. You had elections in October, you still don't have a government. It could easily enter another era of violence. And I think here, NATO has already expanded its force, but at the same time, cooperation with the EU on political economic stabilization measures, in conjunction also with the Gulf region, could be one way of considering to bring greater stability to the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I have a question for Dr. Hooker. Let me start with the next Madrid summit. For the first time, we have 4 or 5 actors from the Indo-Pacific join the summit this year, next week. And we have Japan, South Korea, that is incredibly back. The administration is changed, and we have back the right wing, the conservative. So more a kindly approach to the US and to the NATO. They want to have a special envoy to the NATO for the first time. So we have Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand in Madrid next week. How do you think China can react to this approach to the Indo-Pacific, and how much these countries want to be involved in a very near activities by NATO?
Not in a military sense. I don't see the NATO partners in Indo-Pacific envisioning becoming involved in any kind of meaningful military sense. But they're major economic powers. They do have a global presence. If you add together all of the NATO allies and all of the NATO partners together, it's some 60 plus nations. Altogether, they represent something more than 60% of all the economic and military power on the planet. They share similar political systems, similar values. This represents a lot of power, and not only military power, but political power, diplomatic power, informational power. These are sets of relationships that I think are critical for their security and for our security all over the world. We can have a conversation, and where we have shared interests and commonality of interests, we can come together to address the most pressing problems. China sees this. I probably in a minority, but I'm more confident, I think, in the ability of democracies to contend with the rise of China than many are. And why is that? Well, China is almost a unitary actor. It doesn't really have a close military relationship with Russia. It really doesn't. It does not have a lot of friends and allies in the world. And it's surrounded by economic and militarily significant powers all around its periphery that, when under threat, when incentivized to cooperate with each other, really represent an awful lot of capability to sort of contain and to deter China. You have the makings of a classic balance of power system, with the U.S. tipping the scales with primarily its economic power and its air and maritime power, not so much as a land power. So I'm a little more confident than many seem to be about the ability of the international system to cope. And I think the Chinese see these things that I've just enumerated for you, and it causes them concern. Now, they, in a very intelligent way, they have managed to penetrate European political discourse, European economies, and those sorts of things. And this gives them real leverage over the behavior of many NATO allies and many EU members and so on and so on. And that's something that we need to be careful about, concerned about, and aware of.
Thank you. Ambassador, after the 24th of February, of course, NATO became back, and even President Macron said we thought was almost dead, but after the 24th of February, everything changed, and at the next summit, we will see something revolutionary almost for NATO. But India was involved in something that China called an Asian NATO, the Quad, with Japan, the US, and Australia. Do you think that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and this return of the NATO on the global security system, the Quad will change something? And do you think it's still strategical for India to join an alliance? It's not an alliance, a partnership like the Quad.
Thank you. I think the NATO Secretary General was in India in April, if I'm not mistaken. And they did find a way in which NATO and India could work. Now, that having been said, there has been a widespread, I won't call it amazement, but there was an assumption that India would take sides in the Ukraine-NATO war. India has remained neutral. I can explain it in two ways. First is, one way is to say that we have had a long relationship with Russia. The fact that Russia, then Soviet Union, helped us with the conflict in 1971, with its vetoes in the Security Council, has never been forgotten and will not be. So we are prepared to give Russia an opportunity to see how this thing can be ended in the best way possible under these circumstances. The other side of this is that we are, of course, aware that with the performance of the Russian army in Ukraine, this was the Russian army was really the one which, I should say, won the Second World War. This is not the same army. But in parenthesis, I should say that when I was in Vietnam more than once, I found that the Vietnamese army today is not exactly the army which defeated three other armies. So things change. And we are also aware that because of that, it also points to a weakness in the Russian system if we are ever going to continue to rely on Russian arms, which are the fundamental basis also for our entire weapon system. So that there is a question mark there. And we have actually started buying many more, much larger values of arms from the United States. And we'll continue to do that. But that's one way of explaining why we remain neutral. The second way of explaining is that the way it has been sort of structured now is that if there is a problem in Europe, as indeed the Ukraine-Russia war is, then it must concern the whole world. But if there is a problem which India has, it has an ongoing conflict with China on the border. I have not seen a single statement by a single European country ever saying, is there any way that we can help you? So this Eurocentric view is fine for Europe to take. But if you want people, countries in the Asia Pacific like us to take the same view, then we do expect some quid pro quo for it, which we're not getting. So these are two ways of explaining this whole situation.
Thank you. And what about the Quad?
Sorry?
What about the partnership with Australia and Japan and
Yes. Now, the Quad, the partnership which involves the United States, Japan, and Australia, is actually a very live, ongoing concern, ongoing organization which is doing a large number of things. Let me just quickly mention what it's doing. Apart from providing $1 billion vaccines, it has concentrated on developing critical and emerging technologies. Then cooperation among these countries in the supply chain management, joint technological development, and a strong exchange of information on satellite data and on maritime domain awareness. And this is what they're doing at the moment. Exercises by the four countries have also happened, military exercises. but that's where it rests for the moment. So that is a method of cooperating, because in today's world, it's become pretty clear that there is no real friend and there's no real enemy. It is your interests which have to determine how you're going to handle it. That's what India is doing.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Kok, we have two crises right now in our Eurocentric view, of course. We have the energy crisis and we have the food crisis, probably ongoing in the next few months for the wheat and the stop of the export from Ukraine of wheat. For the first crisis, the energy crisis, we saw an ongoing diplomacy push with the Western countries and the Gulf countries. Do you think will bring a new kind of relations with the US? The next trip of the President Biden will be in Saudi Arabia. And do you think that how much will affect the food crisis to the Maghreb region?
Thank you. I'll start with the second one first, with the food crisis, because obviously here we have the possibility still of a sort of second wave of Arab Spring again erupting. A lot of these countries in North Africa are very fragile. We've seen localized protests already, as well as we have issues with governance, issues overall. And therefore, a factor like a food crisis, which again, given the tremendous dependency these countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, the dependency they have on wheat imports, which so far have come almost 80–90% from the Ukraine or Russia. This has an immediate impact, and I think that should be an issue of concern. This is also where the European Union needs to come in, and maybe we need more of a concerted sort of development assistance plan to help these countries avert a much more severe crisis, because this has implications directly for migration flows, for internal stability and for the whole region. On the energy side, we've seen this push again now towards suddenly this rediscovery of the Gulf, and I'm not so sure yet what exactly the purpose of President Biden's visit to the region. Is it really sort of a recognition of the greater strategic value of the region, and to talk about the overall implications of the shifts going on and how one can re-cement the alliance between the Gulf countries and the US? Or is it really this just short-term sort of idea, well, we just want to put some pressure on Saudi Arabia and the UAE to increase their oil production, and that will bring prices down, and then maybe therefore I'm more safe in terms of in the November elections? It's not quite sure exactly for me yet what the purpose of the visit is. I think it is there to see what might be possible, to explore different options. We have the developments in the region concerning the Abraham Accords, so that opens a whole nother chapter and a whole nother era of possibilities. That's why it's not by accident that the president is first going to Israel and then going to the Gulf. And interesting also that he has the meeting with the Saudi leadership, but he also has the meeting with the 6 GCC states plus Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt to follow. So this is an attempt to try to sort of identify what could be possibilities among the allies, among the friends of the region. But I think the outcome is still not quite clear. On the other hand, I would be very careful to think that establishing these relations with the Gulf states on energy issues is going to be a solution. Because I think we're far from, the Gulf states don't have the magic wand that suddenly will solve all the energy problems. I mean, there's been this approach to Qatar and LNG, but even the Qataris are clearly saying that before 2025, 2026, you cannot expect significant more outflows from the region. So I'd be careful again on just seeing that as the solution to everything.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you if someone of you have some question. Yes, a couple. Do we have a microphone or something? No. Ah, okay. Please, can you go to the microphone to ask the question, and of course, address your question to one of our hosts.
Yes, my name is Carlo Trezza. I'm a member of the scientific board of the NATO Defense College Foundation. My question goes to Mr. Hooker and Mr. Koch. It regards Iran, I would say a major player not only in the Middle East, but in the whole Asian area. Now, my reading of the JCPOA arrangement is that it is not only a way of blocking the nuclear program of Iran, but also to open Iran to the world and including Western economy. Now, by withdrawing from the JCPOA, the United States really abandoned Iran to Russia and China, because they are the countries which will continue dealing with Iran and will continue to trade with Iran. So we're really losing a major partner, and to the advantage of our opponents. I would like to have your reaction to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, Dr. Hooker.
You want me to begin? Okay.
Okay.
First of all, I think your view of JCPOA, and by the way, I supported when I was in government staying in the agreement. Obviously, in the Trump administration, that's not the way the decision went. But there were real concerns about the likelihood of Iran actually observing the conditions of JCPOA and actually halting its enrichment and its nuclear development program. There were strong reasons to think that they would not abide by all of the provisions of the agreement, and it would, in fact, continue to cheat on that to develop nuclear weapons. But I thought it made sense to stay in the agreement, number one, because of all the political capital that had been expended by really close European NATO allies to try to get to some sort of an agreement, and because it provided a mechanism or a way to continue the conversation, to continue the process, which even with bitter enemies is important, I believe. Second point I would make by way of answer is the American approach to Iran is often incomprehensible to many, but if you want to understand the way the crazy Americans think about Iran, you have to go all the way back to the takeover of our embassy in the late 1970s. It was a profound event. Our relations have never recovered. They're not likely to recover anytime in the future. The religious leaders, the mullahs who run Iran, are not particularly interested in accommodation with the United States, and they're not particularly interested in economic integration with the West, because for all kinds of reasons, but regime stability being number one, that's an almost fruitless enterprise. So it's always useful and worthwhile to have a way to dialogue, but I wouldn't look for a dramatic improvement in U.S.-Iranian relations or Iranian relations with the broader West anytime soon. I think we're doomed to be disappointed if that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, I can just pick up on that. I mean, I would question a little bit your premise of saying we're losing a partner. I think for much of the region, Iran hasn't been much of a partner in the past. It's been a very disruptive force for the region. And in terms then of the JCPOA, I think it handles one aspect of the problem with Iran. It handles specifically the nuclear program, but it doesn't handle a lot of the other aspects of troubling behavior, the development of a ballistic missile program, the support for proxy forces in the region. So I think in terms of if you want to sort of think about bringing the JCPOA back, and there's a lot of question marks right now, and we're very much at the point, is JCPOA going to even survive or not? The deal is right now on the table. It's for the Iranians to take it. The compliance for compliance deal that was talked about is basically there. It's the Iranians who haven't taken it at this stage. The whole issue about classification of ICGRC is not even part of the real negotiations. It was brought in through the side door. But ultimately, if we really want to talk about a more lasting JCPOA, we have to talk about the broader picture. So I think one of the shortcomings initially of the 2015 agreement was that it saw the nuclear agreement as sort of an end by itself, whereas it should have been, the momentum should have been used right there to also engage Iran on the wider issues. And I think the Iranians would have been willing to do so, but simply waiting and hoping that the nuclear agreement will lead to a better regional environment is not sufficient enough. Now, we have talks going on in the region at the moment. We have talks between the Iranians and the Saudis going on. We've had 5 rounds. Now, the Saudis have tried to raise certain regional issues, and the Iranians have refused. The only issue on their mind at the moment is reestablishment of diplomatic relations. Now, ultimately, that's not sufficient if we want to have really turn a new page and get to different types of arrangement in the future.
Thank you. We have another question, please.
Foreign Affairs Department of Policy Ethical School in Rome. My question is, in your opinion, is possible a role for India, for your country, in the difficult dialogue between China and the United States, and the difficult dialogue between Russia and the United States? So India is a common partner, like for Russia, as in your wars, like in other issues for United States and for also for the Western states. Thank you.
Ambassador.
What was the question? I didn't follow.
The question was, is there possible a role by India as a mediator in a talk between China and the US, and possibly in a dialogue between China and Russia and the US and Ukraine?
I would say that at this time, it doesn't seem very possible to me, for the simple reason that we are eyeball to eyeball on the parts of the India-China border. That having been said, I should say that China is still our largest trading partner, believe it or not. So both countries have realized that while this conflict situation goes on, and partly it goes on because the way we look at the India-China border and the way they look at the India-China border is not the same. I won't go into more depth, but that is really the thing, that we have one idea where the border should be and they have another idea. But the fact that they have become our largest trading partner must mean something. And what it means is that we have access there in China, and Chinese need access for their products to India. They have been greatly inconvenienced, is a more mild way of putting it, of India actually putting curbs on certain chemical products, as well as on their export of power products and power stations to India. So there is a conflict going on at that level between India and China as well. So all that I can say is that the lines are open. We have not closed any lines with China, but that still, there's a big step from there to going and saying that India could in some way be a meeting point or a mediatory agency for bringing some kind of agreements or whatever between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. I doubt it very much.
Thank you. Yes, please. I don't know how much time we have, but yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for allowing me to speak again. My name is Nasser al-Balushi. I'm the ambassador of Bahrain in Italy. I have a question and then I have comments. My first question is that the Chinese made an agreement with Iran for 25 years. It has been kept secret. They call it sometimes it's concerning the economy. We don't know the content of this agreement, but they have done it in secret. And at the end of the day, there is a pact ongoing between Iran and China. We don't know what it is. My second question is that Iran is a neighbor to the Gulf countries, and we suffer the most from them and from their actions. Number one, for example, I will take just a simple thing. The Bushehr central nuclear, which is on the border of, which is more near to Kuwait City than to Tehran, it is on a seismic grounds. Every time there is a problem. Now just imagine if something like Chernobyl happens there. And believe me, it has been done by the Russians, and I don't think it's an old technology also. If something happens, means we cannot drink the water because we depend 90% on Gulf water to sweeten it, and then we eat it. We drink it, and the fish, which exists also in the Gulf, we depend on it. So the source of food security for us is cut. Water, and which are the most important thing. Now, this is just a very simple example of how we are hurt from Iran. We have 1,000 times approached Iran. We said, don't interfere in our countries. Don't create proxies. But since the arrival of the revolution, they have been working just on that. And the Americans gave them the chance during during President, the last, before Biden, Obama, yeah, that's right. During Obama administration, he offered them, and they started the negotiation. He opened he released some billions of dollars to them, but they used it to finance the proxies. And we said to Americans, they will use it. They said, no, they will not use it. They have a lot of debts to pay. And they have used it for their proxies. Hezbollah become more active, and they have become #1 today producer of Captagon for the whole region and for Europe also. And they do other activities. There is a division on Hezbollah. They know what they are doing exactly. I was part of that. And so they are doing a lot of harms. See, for example, wherever they have influence, the countries are not doing well. In Iraq, elections have been successful, but there is no government. In Lebanon, there are always problems. In Yemen, there is no peace. Now, please, what kind of partner you want? You want a partner that will make, we are the people who has always kept the flow of oil from the Gulf to the rest of the world. And we, the Americans, with the Americans and the Europeans, we have, first the Americans, we have been able to keep that waters clean, and the flow of goods and services goes to the rest of the world. We say, okay, we can start something with you, but please don't interfere into in other countries. They have been doing mischief since 1980. Al-Khobar bombing, name it, to Argentina, to everywhere. You will always find the hands of Iran wet and with a lot of blood. They don't do it maybe directly, but through proxies. So please think about it.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me say that the pact with China is very common that they kept it secret, so it's difficult to understand, to analyze it for all, not only with Iran. If there's someone who wants to comment something, probably Dr. Koch.
We've seen a number of times big announcements about agreements for a long time, but I think the Iranians themselves will likely be disappointed in terms of this agreement and what it ultimately brings to their relationship. It's a volatile situation. Of course, the Chinese will be looking toward, the Iranians will be looking to their partnerships with Russia and China as they continue to be under extreme sanctions regime and isolated. I mean, that's part of their national interest and how they define their national interest. But ultimately, Iran needs to learn how to live with its neighbors. And the ambassador very pointedly said it's a geographic neighbor. You can't change geography. So I think it ultimately would be better to try to find an arrangement with your neighbors immediately, and that will really benefit Iran in the end of the day, rather than just a 25-year agreement with China.
Thank you. I'm sorry we had several questions from the web, but we have no time. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you to the panel. We have an interesting discussion, an interesting comment, very lively. It could go on for a long time, but we have to observe our timetable. And I have the great pleasure and an honor, and not for the first time, to introduce Undersecretary Vella Vedova, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy, representing the Italian government. He's a frequent guest of the foundation, so a sort of, I don't dare to say, sort of honorary member in a way, and I am more than happy to give him the floor to have a view from the government of Italy. Please, Onorevole.
So thank you very much, Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, ladies and gentlemen. We are right on the eve of the NATO summit in Madrid, where allied head of state and government will have a rich and complex agenda on their table. The gathering comes at a remarkable moment, as we are finalizing a new strategic concept that reaffirms our core values, restates our core purpose, and outlines our core tasks for years to come. Since the end of the Cold War, this document has been updated approximately every 10 years to take account of the change of the global security environment and to ensure the alliance is prepared for the future. It drives NATO's strategic adaptation and guides its future political and military development. At the Madrid summit, two significant sets of issues will come together. First, we must endeavor to accomplish the NATO 2030 agenda, an ambitious plan launched at the leaders' meeting in London 2 years ago, to make certain NATO is fit, strong, and united for a new era of increased uncertainty. As NATO adapts to growing global competition and more unpredictable threats, including terrorism, cyber attacks, disruptive technologies, climate change, and challenges to the rule-based international order, it is more critical than ever that allies stand shoulder to shoulder in the face of an increasing complex and unpredictable world. Second, it's clear that the Madrid summit will take place in a new geopolitical context as Russia's attack on Ukraine has fundamentally altered the security architecture of our continent. In the wake of the unprovoked and unlawful attack by Russia to Ukraine, NATO allies responded immediately to increase our readiness to defend our collective security and the values of the democracy and individual freedom on which the transatlantic bond is built. Russia's indiscriminate attacks in the months that followed have had the catastrophic humanitarian consequences. The people of Ukraine have endured horrific violence, senseless suffering, and growing food insecurity. The regional and global implications of Russia's aggression, as we know, cannot be overstated. However, Russia's blatant violation of the fundamental principles of international peace and security and the breach of the international law have not gone unanswered. Allies impose unprecedented and far-reaching economic and financial sanctions. Without a doubt, we stand at the critical juncture and we need to take stock of the implications of this brazen attack on a sovereign state and the overall security of our continent. But we must also take a wide-reaching approach, taking into the account the various elements that are relevant for our shared security. From the very beginning of the crisis, our position on Ukraine has been clear-cut and unambiguous. Italy has provided Kyiv with lethal and non-lethal equipment, including heavy weapons, and we have supported hard-hitting sanctions against the Kremlin, and we have contributed to consolidate a wide international coalition that rejects Russian aggression. We have also prioritized food security, which is instrumental to prevent political upheaval, mass migration, and radicalization across our region and beyond. Looking ahead, Prime Minister Draghi has taken a strong leadership in advocating in favor of granting Ukraine the status of the EU candidate, and the decision will be taken by the European Council in the hours to come, probably tomorrow. Again, this backdrop, let me outline a few points on Italy's role, position, and vision for the future of the alliance. For Italy, NATO must remain fit to its core tasks, flexible and forward-thinking. We must continue to pursue a holistic approach to protect and defend our indivisible security. In other words, we believe NATO is more relevant than ever to our own security. As with any global conflict, there is a natural propensity for public debate about the utility of NATO and its effectiveness in fostering peace and stability. We should not shy away from this. After all, open debate and discussion are critical to successful democracies. For Italy, however, NATO has not been historically just one of the many options to guarantee the stability of the governing principles of international peace and security. It is the enduring and long-term option to safeguard our interests and defend our values. Italy's participation in NATO has been and still is quintessential to what we stand for. Since the signing of the Treaty of Washington in 1949, our membership in the alliance has been intertwined with our commitment to democracy and to individual freedom. It has also been a key component, together with our European inspiration, of our foreign policy. Our contribution to the NATO have substantially advanced Allied shared security throughout the Cold War and beyond. Simply put, NATO is part of our DNA. The question we must address is how NATO will continue to stay relevant as a defensive alliance, fulfilling its mandate to protect 1 billion citizens. The answer lies in our ability to balance wisely the threats and the opportunities that await us. We believe the alliance must stay open, agile, and adaptable at 360 degrees. And by open, I also refer to new membership. Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO would make the alliance stronger and the whole Euro-Atlantic area more secure. In this respect, there is no guarantee of a swift timeline, and the NATO summit in Madrid will probably not represent an end point. However, we must avoid the situation to freeze, and I was saying NATO must be fit for today, but we need to invest in the instruments and capabilities that will ensure our collective security for tomorrow. This brings me to stress a point that the current dramatic state of the world is making clear and urgent. The old mechanism governing the international order, based on the rule of unanimity for the adoption of major decisions, is not up to the task anymore, as it often translates into a less than constructive veto power. This is new and unexpected crisis created by the Russian aggression has only but accelerated the need for organizing world governments on different, more efficient grounds. When it comes to the European Union and its decision mechanism, the recent conference on the future of Europe saw its citizens ask for more European integration in the field of foreign and security policies, among others, and a move in the direction of a qualified majority vote. This is an urgent wake-up call also for NATO, where important decisions risk being taken hostage by the dynamics that have nothing to do with collective security, but rather with leveraging for other concessions, or even worse, for merely domestic reasons. Ladies and gentlemen, we must continue to ask ourselves what we stand for, not what we stand against. NATO is not an alliance that stands against some predefined adversary, but rather a community that stands for its shared values. Italy's contribution to the alliance are critical to protecting our freedom and the values we all share: individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. These values are enshrined in the Washington Treaty. They serve as the bedrock of our unity, solidarity, and cohesion. NATO's longevity and enduring ability to adapt to a changing environment can be attributed to the simplicity of the principles outlined in the Washington Treaty. We stand for a rule-based international order, and we commit to consultations when the security or stability of a member of the alliance is threatened or when our fundamental values and principles are at risk. The challenges and threats of today and tomorrow are numerous, complex, and interconnected. The alliance cannot aspire to address them all. NATO must, however, sharpen its tools and upgrade its capabilities to focus on the ones that matter most for our democracies. The Russian attack on Ukraine has led us to come together and apply the defensive principle of the Washington Treaty in the face of new and emerging challenges, hybrid threats and disinformation tactics carried out by increasingly sophisticated methods and technologies. In a rapidly changing world, the simple nature and the straight context of the Washington bond are still key to preserve and enforce our security, to deter our adversaries, to advance the values we stand for, in order to pass them untouched to the next generations. Thank you.
Thank you, grazie, Onorevole Della Vedova. Thank you very much. Now I think that we have a brief coffee break. You can relax and prepare for the next session, which is promised to be very interesting. So please come back. We are speaking about food security next time.